We all have memories of our childhood science classes, maybe not of what we learned, but of what they were like, confusing, difficult, or worse still, just plain boring.
The hard part is to find time to get across a lot of information and at the same time let the kids discover some of it for themselves. That's a real challenge.
Doctors Jim Moore and Tom Robertson in the University of Georgia's College of Veterinary Medicine and Drs. Steve Oliver and Georgia Hodges in the university's College of Education are determined to find a way to make teaching science more effective and to make science classes more fun.
I'm lucky because I teach in a veterinary school where students are already interested in science. But if you get at younger ages, if you get into high schools or middle schools, the excitement about science just isn't there. And a lot of it is because the tools that are used, not the way the teachers teach it, but the tools that are used are pretty dense and pretty boring. We need to use technology to engage them. And right now we're not doing a good job of that.
Dr. Moore teaches veterinary students about diseases of the horse's gastrointestinal tract, a complicated subject that can be difficult for students to master. He has spent years improving his methods and a few years ago began incorporating 3D animations into his teaching.
The most difficult thing you face in trying to teach complex concepts and subjects is whether or not the students see in their mind the same thing you see in your mind. For years I taught using the conventional techniques with PowerPoint presentations, flat 2D images that I thought were working. But they weren't. Students struggled to understand important concepts about diseases.
Dr. Moore and his colleagues produced a series of animations called the Glass Horse Project, and it radically improved the way that he could teach veterinary students. He noticed the improvements in his students right away.
One of the reasons we created the Glass Horse is that the veterinary students had a hard time envisioning the same things that the clinicians would see in their mind. A veterinary clinician thinks through the process that's going on inside the animal. And all too often the students were thinking what they had to memorize for a test. So we created the Glass Horse to try to create something that the students could use and interact with that would allow them to see what clinicians see.
Given the success of the Glass Horse Project, he started working with Dr. Tom Robertson, a cardiovascular physiologist in the college. After creating animations that helped veterinary students understand intracellular biochemical pathways, they wondered if using these same teaching methods at the high school level would help students learn core scientific principles.
He showed me some examples of the animations they had created in the Glass Horse Project and related things, and my comment was that teachers would love things like that. And his response, as I remember, was, well, let's make them some.
To do this, they started working with Dr. Steve Oliver and Georgia Hodges and put together a team of scientists, 3D animators, and educational gaming experts to create interactive case studies.
One of the main strengths of our group is that we can draw from all different skill sets from across campus. And it comes together as a very, very well functional multidisciplinary team.
One of the most important elements of developing these case studies was including input from the teachers who would be using them.
What I found that I loved about the project is based on my experience as a former science teacher. Instead of creating materials that are just for teachers to use that don't have any teacher input, our team was actually consulting with teachers who were in the classroom every day with a wide variety of students and figuring out what they believe the kids need. And so it was one of the first times I've actually seen a project in which you have collaboration between scientists, science educators, educational researchers, and teachers playing an equal part in the creation of the curricular materials.
In these case studies, the students were presented with real-life scenarios and learned to use the scientific method to learn about basic scientific principles such as diffusion, osmosis, and filtration.
We decided to use case studies because we wanted to create something that required the kids to actually think about something instead of just memorizing something and then telling us what they memorized. So we call it an inquiry. We wanted an inquiry-based environment so that the kids would construct the knowledge instead of just tell us what we've already told them.
It was really interesting. It was like one of those kind of games where you get so annoyed that you can't figure out how to do it that you're going to sit there for the next 3 hours and figure it out one way or another.
The animation team painstakingly built each case study to make sure it was visually appealing, while the scientists ensured that it was scientifically accurate.
If we look at science education in the United States, we're falling behind. We're not attracting good students. We're failing a lot of our students. So I think it's really important for those of us in science to spend time developing educational materials. We need materials that engage the students. We need materials that make them think or enlighten them to the fact that science is fun and research is interesting.
Importantly, these modules are not meant to replace a teacher's role in the classroom. Quite the opposite, they're meant to enhance the student's learning experience by reinforcing what the teachers have gone over.
The teacher in the classroom plays a pivotal role in student learning. So if you want to affect student outcome, we have to look at what the teachers are doing and how the teachers are doing it. From the beginning, our team said, in no way are we trying to replace a teacher like a television, right? Because we know that that's just silly. So instead, it's what can we build with teachers that they can use as a tool to improve student learning and engagement.
One of the case studies focuses on the effects of diabetes on the kidney.
One of the things that we've been trying to focus on is the effect of diabetes, because it's becoming so prevalent in school children these days. We wanted to put filtration in that setting because one of the consequences of diabetes is kidney failure, and the kidney is incredibly important in basically filtering the blood within the body. So in order to get across the principles of filtration, we went to the dialysis machine, which is basically an artificial kidney.
In this interactive study, the students dive into the dialysis machine where they manipulate the filter, collect data, and observe the effects on the outcome of the dialysis treatment. Obviously, the reason for creating interactive case studies was to determine if a more interesting learning experience would translate into more effective learning. To find out, the team tested the case studies with students and compared the results to those students who were taught using traditional methods.
We've got data from multiple studies now where kids are actually learning and progressing in their ability to ask tough questions and think about those questions and then observe something and then explain and justify what they're doing. So we're trying to provide a tool for teachers that helps students to become literate, because we know, for example, we know that 1 out of 3 Americans can't read their blood pressure, right? They can't interpret it. They can see the number, but they can't tell you what it means. So throughout the case studies, you'll see the students having to interpret and analyze that data multiple times so that they can become what we say is scientifically literate. Can they use the skills they learn in school in regular life?
It was very interactive, and it basically reinforced what they had already told us about. It was more helpful than if we had sat in a classroom and read straight out of a book.
As a way of thanking the teachers and students at Washington Wilkes High School who tested the case studies, they were invited to a special day at the College of Veterinary Medicine. During that day, faculty members discussed the evaluation of kidney function in humans and animals, the relevance of the processes highlighted in the case study they had worked through, and the changes that occur in kidney function in humans and animals with diabetes.
We focused on diabetes, especially with this group of kids, because the development of diabetes is becoming such an epidemic, and most of the diabetes that we're seeing is type 2, and most of it is caused by lifestyle changes. So we were talking to these kids because they're young enough to change their lifestyles now so that they don't develop diabetes in the future.
After these discussions, the students toured the veterinary school with Dr. Moore. The students also toured the veterinary teaching hospital to see firsthand the similarities and differences between human and veterinary medicine.
We were able to peer into one of the surgery suites and watch a surgery in progress with the veterinarians and the vet students and the technicians all working together. I think one of the things that they were surprised to see was how similar veterinary medicine and human medicine are.
The tour ended with a close-up and personal discussion about the diagnosis and treatment of diabetes in animals with Dr. Andrew Bugbee, one of the small animal internal medicine residents in the college.
So Steve's kind of a good example of an early diabetic, or kind of if we saw Steve for the first time today, that we'd be suspicious that if he didn't have diabetes now, that he would be predisposed to getting it in the future. And the reason why we think that is because if you can look at Steve, you can tell that he's very overweight.
Is diabetes in animals more common now like it is in people, or?
It's actually a really good question, and I would say it's hard to say if it's more common necessarily, but I think that it's very similar as it is in people. So in people, usually we think about type 1 or kind of child onset diabetes being something that there's no impact of lifestyle on, so diet and exercise don't tend to impact the development of diabetes, whereas in type 2 diabetes we tend to think of occurring later in life and being secondary to a bad diet and not exercising enough and being overweight. And we see those same types of correlates in animals. So dogs typically get a similar version of type 1 diabetes. So it's not because of their lifestyle usually, it's just because their pancreas stopped making insulin, and so we have to supplement them. Whereas in cats, they tend to have a very similar disease course as people do. So kind of like Steve over there, he eats a lot, he gets overweight, he stops responding to his natural insulin, it injures his pancreas, and then eventually he stops making insulin on his own. And that's kind of very similar to how type 2 diabetes is in people. So the biggest thing that we can do is change their kind of behavior and lifestyle. So if they're an overweight cat like Steve, putting him on a low carbohydrate, high protein diet is probably the biggest thing that we could do to help his diabetes. And though he may initially need insulin injections to control his glucose levels, after some time of being on an appropriate diet and losing some weight, he may no longer need the insulin injections at home.
Overall, the goal of everything we're doing is to make science engaging. We've learned, as other people have learned, if students are engaged, they can learn. If they're not engaged, they memorize and forget. Our aim is to get them engaged in the material, have them excited about what they're learning, let them see real-world application to the science that they're learning in school, and see themselves as people with potential careers in science.